What if everything you know about Carlo Acutis' holiness is missing the most important person? Not his mother, not the priests, someone whose name you've probably never heard, someone who shaped Carlo's soul before he could even speak in full sentences. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. The church won't tell you this in official biographies, but Carlo's mother wasn't practicing her faith when he was born. She's admitted this publicly. His father wasn't particularly religious either, which raises an obvious question. How does a 3-year-old start begging to go to church? How does a child who can barely read begin recognizing Christ in the tabernacle? The answer is a woman most people have never heard of, a Polish nanny named Beata Sperczynska, who lived in complete obscurity. Her name almost never appears in documentaries. She gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, asked for zero recognition. Yet without her, Carlo Acutis might not have become a saint at all. And here's why you need to stay until the end, because right now, at this exact moment, you might be doing exactly what she did without realizing it. You might be the invisible influence in someone's life, the person planting seeds you'll never see grow. Or maybe you're struggling with the opposite problem, where you're a parent wondering how to raise children who genuinely love God in a world that makes it nearly impossible. You've tried taking them to church, you've tried explaining theology, but nothing sticks. They're growing up and drifting away. What this woman did worked when nothing else would have, and the reason it worked has nothing to do with being extraordinary. It has everything to do with understanding 3 principles about how souls are actually formed. But here's the catch. These 3 principles only work when applied in a specific sequence, during a specific window of time, in a specific way. Get any part wrong, and you miss the window entirely. That's what makes this story so critical. By the end, you'll know the exact sequence, the exact timing, the exact method. But more importantly, you'll discover which principle you're probably missing right now, the one that makes the other 2 actually work. And then, at the very end, I'm going to show you something that will change everything you think you know about parenting and spiritual influence. Beata left when Carlo was 5 years old. She moved to New York. She wasn't there for his teenage years, his death, his beatification. She was gone for 10 years. And yet on his deathbed at 15, he still credited her. He still remembered her. Everything holy in him, he said, began with her. There's a specific mechanism that makes influence survive absence, a type of formation that actually grows stronger when you're gone. And if you don't understand how this works, you'll spend your whole life trying to be constantly present when what your children actually need is something completely different. I can't tell you what it is yet, because if I do, you'll misapply it. You need to see how it worked in Carlo's life first. But by the end, you'll understand exactly how a woman with only 3 years created an influence that lasted a lifetime, and how you can do the same thing, even if you feel like you've already missed the window or failed. So let's start with the mystery itself. His mother, Antonia Salzano, gives all the interviews. She's on Catholic television, in documentaries, traveling the world sharing Carlo's story. And her testimony is compelling, incredibly moving, because she tells everyone, "I was converted by my son." That's the narrative that captured the world. A non-practicing mother whose teenage son brought her back to God. It's emotional. It's the story the church wanted to tell, but that narrative leaves something out. Antonia openly admits she wasn't living her faith when Carlo was born. She went to Mass occasionally, cultural habit, not devotion. She didn't pray the rosary, didn't have a personal relationship with the Eucharist. She was living a completely secular life in wealthy Milan. Which creates an obvious question that nobody seems to be asking. Where did Carlo's radical spirituality come from? How does a 3-year-old start begging to go to church when his parents never take him? How does a child who can barely speak begin recognizing something sacred in the tabernacle? The answer is Beata Sperczynska, the Polish nanny who came to work for the family in 1993 when Carlo was just 2 years old. She had him for exactly 3 years, just 3 years, from age 2 to age 5. Then she left, got married, moved to New York, built a completely different life. She was thousands of miles away during Carlo's teenage years, during the website building, during the miracles everyone talks about, during his death, during the beatification process. She wasn't there for any of it. Now I know what you're thinking. 3 years? How do we know it was her who shaped him and not something else that happened later? Here's the proof, and this is critical for understanding why timing matters more than duration. When Beata left at age 5, Carlo's spiritual foundation was already unshakable, not developing, not beginning, but already set. At 5 years old, he was already asking to attend Mass daily, already recognizing Jesus in the tabernacle, already organizing his entire life around closeness to the Eucharist. And here's what seals it. Years later, when people asked teenage Carlo where his devotion came from, he would speak of Beata with profound gratitude. He never forgot her. Even as a 15-year-old building websites about Eucharistic miracles, he remembered the Polish woman who first taught him to genuflect, who first brought him to church, who first showed him that Jesus was actually present in the tabernacle. His own testimony confirms it. The seeds weren't planted during his teenage years, they were planted between ages 2 and 5. Everything that came after was growth from that foundation. Now watch closely, because what she did in those 3 years violated almost everything modern parenting tells you about forming faith in children, and that's exactly why it worked. To understand what made her different, you need to know where she came from. Beata Anna Sperczynska arrived in Italy in 1993, like thousands of other Polish immigrants, looking for work, sending money back home, trying to build a better life. The Acutis family hired her as a nanny when Carlo was just 2 years old. But she carried something with her that made her completely different from everyone else in that wealthy Milan neighborhood, a faith forged in fire. Not the comfortable cultural Catholicism of Western Europe, but something else entirely. Something born under communist oppression in Poland, where believing in God could cost you everything. This is important for you to understand, because it explains why she had the power to shape a saint when nobody else could. Polish Catholics under communism didn't treat faith like a Sunday hobby. Churches weren't social clubs, they were refuges, places where people risked their safety just to worship. Mary wasn't a distant theological concept, but a mother to a suffering nation. People whispered prayers in their kitchens because praying openly meant inviting trouble. This was faith that knew God wasn't optional. He was survival itself, hope when everything else was darkness. When this woman walked into the Acutis home, she brought all of that with her, but here's what you need to grasp. She didn't announce it, didn't make speeches about her deep spirituality. She simply lived it. The way she breathed, the way she moved through ordinary tasks, the way she existed in the world. She prayed while folding laundry, not formal prayers, just conversations with God as natural as talking to someone in the room. She whispered Hail Marys while preparing meals, hummed Polish Marian hymns quietly as she cleaned. And here's where the first principle reveals itself, the one that most parents completely miss. Children don't learn from what you say about God. They learn from how you exist when you think nobody's watching. The Acutis home already had everything money could buy: expensive furniture, modern technology, designer clothes, all the comforts of Italy's upper class. What it didn't have was what this woman brought through the door every morning. Someone who treated the invisible world as more real than the visible one. Someone who saw every moment as an opportunity for prayer. Someone who knew how to find God in folding clothes and washing dishes. What young Carlo witnessed day after day was a woman who lived as if Jesus was standing right beside her, not metaphorically, not in some vague spiritual sense, but actually beside her. This created something powerful in that household, a contrast Carlo couldn't ignore even as a small child. His mother was loving, devoted to him, but spiritually empty at that time in her life. His father provided everything, but religion wasn't part of his world. Beata was different. She carried something they didn't, and children, especially very young children, they notice these things immediately. They sense who lives with depth, who moves with peace, who acts as if there's more to reality than what eyes can see. Here's how this applies to you today. You don't need to be a theological expert. You don't need to memorize catechism answers. Your children don't need you to explain the Trinity perfectly. They need to catch you praying when you think no one's looking. They need to witness you treating God as actually real in ordinary moments. Are you praying while driving them to school? Are you thanking God out loud when good things happen? Are you turning to Scripture when you're stressed instead of your phone? They're watching, even when you think they're not paying attention, especially when you think they're not paying attention. But witness alone isn't enough, which brings us to the second principle. And this one will surprise you because it goes against everything modern psychology tells parents about child development. Ages 2 to 5 matter more than every other developmental stage combined. Miss this window and you're building on sand. Here's what neuroscience now confirms, but Beata understood instinctively. During ages 2 to 5, a child's brain builds its fundamental understanding of reality, relationship, and God. They're not learning theology, they're absorbing atmosphere. They're not memorizing doctrines, they're experiencing presence. Their brains are literally being wired by what they witness, who they watch, how the adults around them live. This is why Beata didn't wait until Carlo could understand big concepts. She started when he couldn't even walk steadily, because she knew that foundation gets laid early or it doesn't get laid at all. Carlo couldn't even walk steadily when she started teaching him prayers. He was barely past being a toddler. Most parents at this stage are just trying to get through the day. But she saw something different, a soul that needed forming right now, not later, not when he was old enough to understand theology, but right now. She would hold his tiny hands together and guide him through the gestures, in the name of the Father, making the sign of the cross over his forehead so gently it felt like pure blessing. And the Son, over his heart, placing God right where love lived, and the Holy Spirit, not performance, not ritual, but presence. She was teaching him that prayer was presence. By the time most parents start formal religious education at age 7 or 8, Carlo's foundation was already granite solid. He wasn't learning about the Eucharist in First Communion classes. He was already in love with the Eucharist, had been for years. The 3 years between 2 and 5 shaped a saint, and everything after was just growth from that foundation. Here's how this applies to you today. If your children are between 2 and 5 right now, you're standing in the most important window of their entire spiritual formation, not when they're teenagers, not when they can understand theology, but right now. And if your children are already past this age, don't despair, there's still hope. But you need to understand what you're working against. You're now correcting patterns instead of establishing them, rewiring instead of wiring for the first time. It's harder, it requires more intensity, more consistency, more patience. But it's not impossible, which brings us to the third and most powerful principle, the one that makes the other two actually work. Repetition builds neural pathways. Daily practice develops character. One powerful moment changes nothing. 1,000 simple moments change everything. Beata didn't have dramatic spiritual moments with Carlo. She had the same simple moments repeated thousands of times, same prayers before bed, same visits to church, same gentle corrections, same whispered conversations about Jesus. When his parents were busy with work, when Milan's demanding social scene pulled them away, when the responsibilities of wealth took their attention, she brought Carlo to church with her. Not because her job description required it, because she couldn't imagine a day without visiting Jesus, and she couldn't imagine visiting him without bringing this little boy who was growing so close to her heart. The churches were quiet during weekday mornings. Empty pews, no elaborate ceremonies, no crowds of worshippers, just the tabernacle, the red sanctuary lamp burning, and a Polish woman kneeling with a small child beside her. And here's what she taught him that changed everything. She taught him to greet Jesus when entering a church, not the building itself, not the beautiful architecture, not the statues or stained glass. Jesus, the actual person present in the tabernacle. She would genuflect, and he would watch her. She showed him the sanctuary lamp burning near the tabernacle. She explained in the simplest words that this light meant someone was home, that Jesus was there. Right there, always waiting, always hoping someone would visit. This wasn't abstract theology. This was relationship training. How do you treat someone you love? You visit them. You acknowledge them. You don't walk past them without saying hello. Day after day, week after week, month after month, for 3 years. His famous saying, the phrase that would later appear on prayer cards all over the world. That declaration he made as a boy that became the mission statement of his entire life, to always be close to Jesus. That's my life plan. Where did that come from? How does a child formulate something so profound? It came from watching a woman live as if closeness to Jesus was literally the only thing that mattered. She didn't tell him to have that life plan. She didn't lecture him about the importance of spiritual intimacy. She showed him, day after day, year after year, through her own unwavering devotion, how this applies to you today. You don't need one amazing spiritual retreat with your kids. You need daily prayers before meals. You don't need to take them to Lourdes. You need to take them to adoration on Tuesday afternoons. You don't need dramatic religious experiences. You need consistent, faithful, ordinary witness. Are you praying the same bedtime prayers with them every single night? Are you visiting church with them on the same weekday every week? Are you reading the same Bible stories on repeat until they're memorized? This is how neural pathways get built. This is how habits form. This is how character develops, not through intensity, but through consistency. But here's where most parents fail. They do it for a few weeks, maybe a few months. Then life gets busy. Something disrupts the pattern. They tell themselves they'll start again next month. And the window closes. Now watch what happens when all 3 principles work together, when witness, timing, and consistency combine. Because what I'm about to show you is the moment that proved everything had worked. The moment when seeds planted in darkness broke through into light. The family still talks about this moment. Beata took Carlo into a church one morning. He was around 4 years old enough to walk on his own now, old enough to understand more than simple words, but still very young. She brought him to the pew, showed him how to kneel, not just bending his knees, but folding his whole body into an attitude of reverence. She showed him how to be still, how to be present, how to look at the tabernacle not with casual glances, but with real attention. And something happened. Carlo became transfixed, not distracted, not fidgeting the way children do when they're bored, but genuinely, deeply captivated. He stared at the tabernacle as if he could see through the gold, as if his young eyes were perceiving something adults miss. Beata watched him but didn't interrupt, didn't rush him. She let the moment unfold, recognized what was happening, even if she couldn't name it. God was meeting this child. This small boy was encountering the presence that would define every choice, every action, every breath of his short, extraordinary life. It wasn't dramatic, no vision, no voice from heaven, no miraculous sign, just a Polish woman, a small boy, and the Eucharistic presence filling a quiet church on an ordinary day. But it was the spark, the first real flame of devotion that would grow into a fire nothing could extinguish. And here's how you know something profound happened in that moment. Here's the proof that this wasn't just a child's passing interest. When Beata brought Carlo home that day, his mother noticed immediately that he was different, quieter, more thoughtful, more focused. That night, 4-year-old Carlo asked if they could visit Jesus again tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Within a week, he was asking to go to church every single day, not because Beata was forcing him, not because his parents were pushing him, but because he had fallen in love. This was when Carlo fell in love with the Eucharist. Not later when he was older and could understand theology, not when some priest gave him a good explanation, but right then, at age 4, in a quiet church with a woman who knew how to create space for God to work. Notice what happened here. Beata didn't make this moment happen. She couldn't. She simply created the conditions where it could happen. She brought him consistently, taught him how to be present, showed him where to look, demonstrated reverence through her own body and attention. Then she got out of the way. This is the secret most parents miss. You can't force an encounter with God, but you can create the conditions. You can bring them to the right places, teach them how to pay attention, model what reverence looks like, be consistent enough that when the moment comes, they're ready to receive it. And then you trust God to do what only He can do. Years passed, and Carlo grew from a small boy into a teenager. His peers were obsessed with video games, fashion, popularity, normal teenage stuff. Carlo liked those things too. He played PlayStation, wore jeans and Nike sneakers, watched movies, had friends. He looked like every other kid in Milan. But while other teenagers slept in on Sunday mornings, Carlo attended daily mass every single day. The devotion planted at age 2 never wavered. While others used computers for entertainment, Carlo was building something extraordinary. At age 11, he taught himself advanced computer programming. Not to make money, not to impress anyone, but to document Eucharistic miracles around the world. An 11-year-old boy spending months researching, writing, coding a website about the real presence. He eventually created a 196-part exhibition that traveled to all 5 continents and was displayed at the Vatican. One day, Carlo was walking to church with Rajesh Mohur, the family's caretaker, when outside the church, they saw a homeless man named Emmanuel sleeping on a piece of cardboard, just lying there on the cold ground. Carlo stopped, looked at the man and began to cry, not polite tears but real, shaking sobs. He was devastated. Rajesh watched this wealthy teenager from one of Milan's nicest neighborhoods completely break down over a man most people walked past without noticing. Carlo turned to his mother when he got home and asked her to buy a sleeping bag for Emmanuel so the man could sleep warm instead of on cardboard. Then he asked his parents for permission to bring food to him every night, every single night. With his allowance money he could have spent on video games or clothes or anything a teenager wants, Carlo bought sleeping bags and warm blankets for homeless people. He bought thermoses so he could fill them with hot drinks. Part of his daily routine became setting aside some of his own dinner to bring to people living on the streets. At school, Carlo was known for defending kids who were bullied, especially disabled kids who others picked on. When a friend's parents were going through a divorce, Carlo made sure that friend felt included in the Acutis family life. He tutored classmates struggling with homework, helped friends who were experimenting with drugs or trapped in pornography. He did all of this while maintaining his own spiritual life. Daily Mass, weekly confession, daily rosary, hours of prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. His classmates wondered where this came from, but Carlo knew. Everything holy in him, he would say, began in childhood, planted quietly, without fanfare, by people who loved God and showed him how. Not his teenage years, not his own discovery, but childhood, ages 2 to 5, with a Polish woman who prayed while folding laundry. Then came the moment that proved just how deep those roots went, the moment that showed whether Beata's formation would survive the ultimate test. In October 2006, Carlo started feeling sick. His parents thought it was the flu, normal teenage illness, nothing to worry about. But the symptoms got worse, so they took him to the hospital in Milan. The doctors ran tests, and then they delivered news that shattered his family. Acute promyelocytic leukemia, one of the worst, most aggressive forms. Carlo had maybe days to live. 15 years old, his whole life ahead of him, all those gifts, that holiness, that potential, about to be cut short. This is where most teenagers would break, where most of us would scream at God, where faith would crumble under the weight of unfairness. But Carlo looked at his parents with stunning clarity and said something that left the doctors speechless, something that proved everything planted in him had taken root so deep, nothing could shake it. He said, "I offer all the suffering I will have to suffer for the Lord, for the Pope, and for the Church." 15 years old, dying, and his first thought wasn't, Why me, but how he could offer this for others. When the nurses came to care for him, when the pain got intense, they would ask how he was feeling. Carlo would say, "There are people who suffer much more than me, dying of leukemia and thinking about other people's pain." His mother asked him later if he was afraid. He smiled and said he wanted to offer his suffering so he wouldn't have to go to purgatory, so he could go straight to heaven and see Jesus face to face. The same Jesus Beata had introduced him to in that quiet church when he was 4 years old. On October 12, 2006, he died. He was 15 years and 5 months old. The church at his funeral overflowed with people, classmates, teachers, homeless people he had fed, disabled kids he had defended, all of them there because this teenager had shown them what love actually looks like. And every single bit of it traced back to what was planted between ages 2 and 5. Now here's the part most people don't want to hear, the uncomfortable truth that makes this story either inspiring or devastating, depending on your situation. When Beata got married in 1996, she had spent just 3 years with Carlo. Then she went on to build an impressive career, eventually moved to New York, became a director in an international company, built a completely different life. But the bond they formed during those 3 years was too deep to break. She continued visiting the Acutis family, had a son named Conrad, and Carlo would play with him. The connection remained. When Carlo spoke about where his faith came from, he would mention her with profound gratitude. They remembered the prayers she taught him, the churches she brought him to, the example she lived before him during those critical early years. After Carlo died, Antonia began speaking publicly about her son, gave interviews, wrote books, traveled the world sharing Carlo's story. And in those conversations, she openly acknowledged what had happened, said it clearly. Beata was one of the first people to talk to Carlo about God, the one who instilled in him a love for Jesus in the Eucharist. Antonia recognized that God had used this humble Polish woman to form her son's faith during those 3 years when she herself hadn't been capable of doing so. The family considered Beata almost a second mother to Carlo, not because she replaced Antonia, no one could, but because she had given him something equally essential during those 3 years. She had given him his first introduction to the faith that would define him. For years after Carlo's death, Beata gave no interviews, attended no ceremonies, made no public statements. While Antonia traveled the world telling Carlo's story, Beata lived privately in New York. Even when Carlo was beatified in 2020, even when his canonization was announced, she remained silent. It wasn't until October 2025, after Carlo was already declared a saint, that she finally gave one interview to a Polish Catholic magazine. One interview after nearly 2 decades of silence. She never sought recognition for any of it, didn't write her own account of Carlo's childhood, lived exactly as she had always lived, quietly, privately, known only to God and those who had witnessed her devotion firsthand. She shaped a saint in 3 years and asked for nothing in return. So here's what you need to understand, what you need to take from this story and apply immediately, because knowing these 3 principles means nothing if you don't use them. First, examine your witness. Your children are watching you right now, this very day, this very hour. What are they seeing? When you're stressed, do you pray or scroll your phone? When something good happens, do you thank God out loud or just move on? When you face a decision, do they ever witness you consulting scripture or asking for God's guidance? Be ruthlessly honest. Are you living as if God is real? Or are you living like everyone else who doesn't believe, but you just happen to attend church occasionally? Children have extraordinary detectors for hypocrisy, can sense the difference between someone who talks about God and someone who lives with God. Beata never had to tell Carlo that God was real. Her entire existence testified to it. What does your existence testify to? Second, assess the window. If you have children between ages 2 and 5, understand that you are standing in the most critical formation period of their entire lives, not when they're older, not when they can understand complex theology, but right now. What are you doing with this window? Are you being intentional? Are you teaching them prayers even though they can barely talk? Are you bringing them to church even though they can't sit still? Are you showing them how to make the sign of the cross even though their little hands can't quite coordinate the movements? Or are you waiting until they're older, waiting until it's more convenient, waiting until they can understand better? The window doesn't wait, it closes, and once it closes, everything becomes harder. If your children are past this age, don't despair, but increase the intensity, increase the consistency. You're now correcting patterns instead of establishing them, which requires more deliberate effort, more patience, more creativity. But it's not impossible. God can work miracles at any age. Third, commit to consistency. This is where most parents fail. They start strong, pray with their kids for a week, maybe a month. They take them to church a few times, read Bible stories at bedtime occasionally. Then life gets busy, something disrupts the pattern. They tell themselves they'll start again soon. And nothing sticks, because consistency is what builds neural pathways. Repetition is what forms character. Daily practice is what creates permanent change. Beata didn't do dramatic things with Carlo. She did simple things every single day for 3 years. Same prayers, same visits to church, same gentle corrections, same whispered conversations about Jesus. That's what created a saint. Are you willing to commit to that level of consistency? Are you willing to pray the same bedtime prayers with your children every single night for years? Are you willing to take them to church on the same weekday every week without exception? Are you willing to read the same Bible stories on repeat until they're memorized? This is the cost, not intensity, but consistency. Now here's the question you need to answer honestly, and it might sting, but it's essential. If your children never become saints, if they drift from faith as teenagers, if they abandon God as adults, will it be because you failed to do what Beata did during the window that mattered most? Will it be because you waited too long, because you weren't consistent enough, because you talked about God but they never witnessed you actually living with Him? Or will it be because you did everything right, you were faithful in the window, you showed them authentic witness and consistent devotion, but they chose differently when they were old enough to choose? There's a difference, and you need to know which one applies to you. Because if it's the first category, you still have time to change. If your children are young enough, the window might still be open. You can start today, right now, this very evening. But if you wait, if you keep telling yourself you'll be more intentional next month, next year, when things calm down, you might miss it entirely. And that's a risk you cannot afford to take. Now I need to show you the one thing that makes everything else I've told you actually work. Because you can have perfect witness, you can understand the timing, you can be ruthlessly consistent, but if you miss this one element, everything you build will collapse the moment you're not there. And this is what most parents are getting devastatingly wrong. Remember what I told you at the beginning? Beata was gone for 10 years, absent for all the moments everyone celebrates about Carlo. And yet when 15-year-old Carlo was asked about his faith, he credited her. When he spoke about where his devotion came from, he remembered her. 10 years of complete absence, thousands of miles of distance, and her influence hadn't faded, it had grown stronger. How is that possible? How does someone who was only present for 3 years create an influence so deep it survives a decade of absence? Here's the mechanism most parents completely miss. Beata never made herself the center of Carlo's faith. Think about what she actually did during those 3 years. She didn't bring Carlo to church to spend time with her. She brought him to meet someone else. She didn't teach him to pray to feel close to her. She taught him to pray to talk to Jesus. She didn't position herself as the source of comfort or wisdom. She pointed past herself to the one who would be there when she couldn't be. Every single thing she did was designed to build a relationship that didn't depend on her presence. When she genuflected, she wasn't teaching Carlo to honor her reverence. She was teaching him to acknowledge Jesus in the tabernacle. When she explained the Eucharist, she wasn't teaching theological facts. She was introducing him to a person who was actually there. When she prayed while folding laundry, she wasn't performing spirituality. She was showing him what it looks like to talk to someone who's always listening. Do you see what she was doing? She was building Carlo's relationship with Jesus so that when she eventually left, Jesus would still be there. The tabernacle would still be burning, the Eucharist would still be present. The relationship would continue without her. This is the mechanism that makes influence survive absence. And here's the proof it worked. When Beata left at age 5, Carlo didn't stop going to church, he went more. He didn't lose his devotion to the Eucharist, it deepened. He didn't forget what she taught him, he lived it more radically than she could have imagined. Because what she built wasn't Carlo's relationship with her, it was Carlo's relationship with Jesus. And that relationship didn't need her to maintain it. Now watch what happens when you understand this. Most parents today are exhausting themselves, trying to be constantly present, trying to be the answer to every question, trying to be the source of their children's spiritual strength. And so their children's faith becomes dependent on them being there. When they're present, the kids pray. When they're gone, the prayers stop. When they're watching, the kids behave. When they're not, everything changes. When they're pushing, the kids participate. When they stop pushing, participation ends. This is influence that requires constant maintenance. And the moment you can't be there, the moment life pulls you away, the moment your kids grow up and move out, everything collapses. Beata did something completely different. She used her 3 years to build something that didn't require her constant presence. She pointed so clearly, so consistently, so powerfully to Jesus that when she left, the relationship continued without her. And this is what changes everything for you right now. You don't need to be there every moment. You need to use the moments you have to point them towards someone who will be. You don't need to be the answer to every spiritual question. You need to show them where the answer is. You don't need to create their dependence on you. You need to build their dependence on Him. Here's how this works practically. When you pray with your children, you're not performing. You're introducing them to someone who's listening. When you take them to church, you're not fulfilling duty. You're bringing them to meet someone who's actually there. When you talk about Jesus, you're not teaching theology. You're describing someone you actually know. Stop trying to be the center. Start pointing to Him. Stop trying to be constantly present. Start building something that survives your absence. Stop trying to be irreplaceable. Start connecting them to the one who actually is. Because here's the beautiful truth. Beata only had 3 years. Just 3 years, with massive limitations. She was a nanny with a job, with her own life, with responsibilities that eventually took her to another country. And 3 years was enough. Not because she was perfect, but because she understood that her job wasn't to be Carlo's source. Her job was to show him where the source is. And she did it so well that 10 years later, when he was dying, he was still drinking from that same source she had first shown him. That's what made all the difference. Not her constant presence, but the relationship she built that survived her absence. Not her perfection, but her clarity about who the real center was. Not her irreplaceability, but her willingness to point past herself to Jesus. This is how you change someone's eternity. Not by being everything for them, but by showing them where everything is. Not by making them dependent on you, but by connecting them to the one they can depend on forever. Not by being unforgettable, but by pointing so clearly to Jesus that when they remember you, they see Him. That's the mechanism. That's what survives absence. That's what builds saints. And you can start doing it today, right now, in the next conversation, the next prayer, the next ordinary moment where you have the chance to point someone toward the God who will be there long after you're gone. This is how God works, not through the spotlight, not through the obvious channels, not through the people with platforms and massive influence. God works through people like Beata, through those who show up day after day in unremarkable moments that nobody photographs or celebrates. The ones who pray while folding laundry, who whisper prayers while cooking meals, who teach children to genuflect and explain the Eucharist with simple conviction, who live their faith so consistently it becomes contagious. Saints are not built by dramatic events, but by devoted influences, by people who show up day after day, year after year, living what they believe without compromise. By people who understand that the most important work happens in simple moments: a prayer before bedtime, a visit to a church, a conversation about why Jesus matters, consistent witness to what loving God looks like. The church celebrates Carlo Acutis now. His tomb draws pilgrims from around the world. He's been canonized as a saint. Books are written, documentaries are made. His image appears everywhere. Millions of people know his name. But heaven knows another name. Heaven knows Beata Anna Sperczynska, the Polish woman who knelt beside him in empty churches, who taught him to see Jesus in the tabernacle, who planted the seeds that would grow into extraordinary holiness. And heaven knows something else about her, something that reveals the ultimate power of what she did. Heaven knows that she didn't make Carlo dependent on her presence, she made him dependent on Jesus's presence, and that's why her influence survived when she couldn't be there. God remembers her name, even if the world has forgotten it, knows every prayer she whispered over that little boy, counted every tear she shed for his soul. God recorded every time she brought him to church. Every time she showed him how to genuflect, every time she explained that Jesus was waiting for him in the tabernacle. And God especially honors this, that she pointed past herself to him, that she never made it about her, never created a faith that required her constant maintenance, never positioned herself as irreplaceable. She showed Carlo where Jesus was, and then she trusted Jesus to be enough when she was gone. Nothing was wasted, nothing was forgotten. Every moment of faithful hidden service is written in heaven's memory. Behind every saint, there's someone who understood that the greatest influence isn't making yourself indispensable. It's pointing so clearly to Jesus that when you're gone, he's still there. And that someone might be you. Right now, today, this week, you might be the hidden influence in someone else's story, the person who's planting seeds you'll never see grow in this life, the one who's pointing a soul toward God. You're folding laundry and praying, driving your kids somewhere and teaching them something true, showing up consistently in someone's life and demonstrating what it looks like to actually believe what you say you believe. And you wonder if it matters, wonder if anyone notices, wonder if you're making any real difference. This story is your answer. This Polish woman's life is proof that what you're doing matters more than anything happening on any stage anywhere in the world, but only if you're doing what she did, pointing past yourself to Jesus. So here's what I want to know. Who was that person for you? Who was the quiet spiritual influence in your life? The one who prayed for you, showed you what faith looks like, planted seeds in your soul that are still growing, still producing fruit, still shaping who you're becoming? And more importantly, did they point you to themselves, or did they point you to Jesus? That's what made their influence last. That's what made it survive their absence. That's what made it shape you permanently instead of temporarily. Take a moment and leave their name in the comments. Let's honor the hidden heroes, the quiet saints, the ones who shaped us when no one was watching, the ones who didn't make themselves the center, but who showed us where the center is. And if you're that person for someone else right now, if you're the parent or grandparent or teacher or friend who's living your faith in front of others, wondering if it matters, wondering if anyone notices, wondering if you're wasting your time, don't stop. Keep praying, keep being faithful, keep showing them what it looks like to love Jesus with your whole life, not just your words. But remember this, don't make it about you, make it about Him. Don't build their faith on your constant presence, build their faith on His constant presence. Don't try to be the source they return to, show them where the source is so they can return to Him when you're not there. Because you never know, you might be forming the next Carlo Acutis, might be planting seeds that will grow into holiness you can't imagine. The Polish nanny probably never imagined it either. She was just living her faith, doing her job, treating a small boy with love, and pointing him toward Jesus every single day. Not toward herself, toward Jesus. She thought she was just a nanny, just someone helping a family, just doing ordinary work in an ordinary house in Milan. But God saw something different. God saw her forming a saint, saw her planting seeds that would eventually draw millions of people closer to him. And here's what made it work. She planted those seeds in soil that didn't belong to her. She pointed Carlo to a relationship that didn't depend on her. So when she left, the seeds kept growing, because they were rooted in Jesus, not in her. That's the untold story, the hidden influence, the mechanism that changes everything. The woman who formed a saint by simply living what she believed, day after day after day, in the most ordinary and most powerful way possible. The woman who understood that her greatest gift to Carlo wasn't her presence, it was introducing him to the presence that would never leave. Share this story. Let people know about the quiet heroes who shape the church's future. Let's honor the hidden ones whose faithfulness matters more than anything else happening in this world. Because you might be one of them. And if you are, heaven sees you. Heaven knows your name. Heaven is recording every prayer, every act of service, every moment you point someone past yourself toward Jesus. And one day, when all is revealed, when heaven opens its books and shows what actually mattered, there will be names written alongside Beatas. The hidden ones who shaped the visible saints, the quiet influences who changed the world by simply loving one soul at a time. Not by making themselves the center, but by pointing to the center. Not by trying to be constantly present, but by introducing others to the one who is. Not by building dependence on themselves, but by building relationships with Jesus that survived their absence. That's how God works. That's how saints are made. That's how kingdoms are built. In the hidden places, through the faithful people, by the ones who understood the secret, your greatest influence comes not from being irreplaceable, but from pointing so clearly to Jesus that when you're gone, he's still there.